Difference between disciple and apostle is something that generates curiosity in many Bible readers, especially because some men are called disciples in certain biblical texts, and then in other parts of the Bible, these same men are identified as apostles. And then that kind of question always comes up. Were these men disciples or apostles? Or were they both? How to understand this question? Is there a difference between disciples and apostles? But in this video, you will understand in a very simple way what is the difference between disciple and apostle in a way that you will never confuse these two words. Well, the first point we can consider here is that disciples and apostles really are not the same. It is even easy to understand the difference between disciple and apostle when we seek the meaning of biblical terms translated by these two words. This is because the word disciple in the Bible translates a Greek term that it means apprentice or student. And this Greek term is used more than 200 times only in the first 5 books of the New Testament. So, basically, a disciple is a person who is willing to learn from someone. And a very interesting thing is that in Bible epistles in the New Testament, another Greek word is also employed to convey such a meaning. And this word is applied to identify a follower or imitator of someone. So a disciple is a student, is an apprentice, is a follower or an imitator of someone else. The word apostle also has a Greek origin and indicates a person who is sent by someone as a type of delegate or messenger. Then, in other words, the apostle is a representative of another person who acts under the order and authority of the sent. But one thing that many people do not know is that the words disciple and apostle are applied in the Bible both in their broader sense as in its strict sense. In the broader sense, the Bible speaks of a large number of people who followed the Lord Jesus. These people were their disciples. Even the Gospel of Luke records an occasion when Jesus gave a task to a group of 70 disciples. This is there in Luke. Another example we can mention here is also that of Joseph of Arimathea, who was a member of the Sanhedrin and was one of the secret disciples of Jesus. And it may also have occurred with the Nicodemus Pharisee. Moreover, Jesus was not the only one who had disciples at that time. John the Baptist, for example, or even the Pharisees and other groups also had their own disciples. With regard to the word apostle, we can say exactly the same thing. In a broader sense, the word apostle is employed to speak of several Christians who have been involved with the Lord's work in the time of the early church. These believers were sent by the leadership of the church for the purpose of performing certain functions. So, as representatives not only of those who exercised the ministry of leadership in the early years of the Christian church, but also of the local communities themselves, these Christians, who serve basically as delegates, are also called apostles in the biblical text. And it is in this sense that the Bible refers as apostles to people like Silas, Barnabas, Timothy, and other Christians. But on the other hand, in its strict sense, in biblical texts, the word disciples, that's why we talk about 12 disciples of Jesus. These men were nearby followers and apprentices of Jesus throughout their earthly ministry. At this time, they were discipleship, shaped, and perfected so that they could fulfill a very special mission after Jesus' rise to heaven, after the resurrection. So in other words, these disciples were prepared by Christ to be his witnesses and continue his ministry on earth leading his church. And the strict application of the word apostle has to do with ity. You may notice that one thing is directly linked to another, because with the exception of Judas Iscariot, the traitor disciple, all other disciples became apostles. So this is how the word apostle is employed in its strict sense in the Bible, then designating the 11 original disciples as well as a Matthias, which was later chosen to compose the group of 12 instead of Judas Iscariot. These men, like their apostles, were chosen by God to launch the foundations of the church. As we read in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 20. And alongside them the Lord also chose, called and commissioned the apostle Paul, who became known as the apostle of the Gentiles. So, in this strict sense, Paul was the last to be called the apostle in the Bible. Even Paul himself knew this when he spoke of himself as an apostle out of time, in his first letter to the Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 8. And that means that there are no more apostles, in the strict sense of the word. The last one was Paul. So in short, the disciple is an apprentice, while the apostle is someone prepared and sent on a mission as a representative of a higher authority. And in view of this, we can even make a very interesting practical application. Because when we understand the difference between disciple and apostle, we also realize that before being an apostle, we must be a disciple. Because in order to perform a mission properly, you first need to learn and have the proper preparation. So while it is true that the Bible highlights the group of those who were chosen by the Lord to be the first leaders of his church on earth as disciples and apostles of a kind that no longer repeat it, it is also true that, in a way generally, all Christians are called for both positions. We are called to follow Jesus as his faithful disciples, and consequently we are also called to serve him as his apostles, witnessing before the world about the grandiose works of him who called us from darkness to his wonderful light. This is what the Apostle Peter writes in his first letter, in chapter 2, verse 9, when he says that we are elected generation, royal priesthood, holy nation, exclusive people of God, to announce the greatness of the one who called them from darkness to your wonderful light. Then we need to be good disciples of the Lord Jesus, so that we may also be his apostles before the world.
You reached the end, and that's more than just watching a video. It's an act of attention in a time where almost no one listens to the end. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you want, share this with someone who values this as much as you do. Thanks, a big hug, and see you next time.